Most of us are probably very well aware that much of the world boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. But what you may not know is that this wasn't the only Olympic boycott, and not by a long shot. So today, let's talk about the other Olympic Games that were boycotted by one or more countries. The 1956 Melbourne Olympics. These Olympics were the first time there was a real meaningful boycott or non-attendance of an Olympic Games in history, and it happened in a somewhat surprising place, and it involved a pretty mixed array of countries. In all, there were 8 countries that boycotted these Olympic Games: Egypt, Iraq, Lebanon, the Netherlands, Cambodia, Spain, Switzerland, and the People's Republic of China. Now, you'd be more than forgiven for being a bit surprised by this list of nations, as they don't seem to have a lot in common when it comes to diplomacy, international relations, or athletics. But each of these countries did have a reason for not being there. For Egypt, Iraq, and Lebanon, you history nerds will know that these Olympics came very soon after the Suez Canal crisis, which was where a coalition involving Israel, the UK, and France invaded Egypt. So they didn't participate because of that. Cambodia also didn't participate because of that too, even though they weren't as directly involved in the conflict. For Spain, Switzerland, and the Netherlands, they chose to boycott these Olympics because the Soviet Union was going to be there. And I can almost hear you history nerds again connecting the dots and noticing that these Olympics were happening at almost the same time as the Hungarian uprising, which the Soviet Union brutally and infamously crushed. So these 3 countries used the Olympics as an opportunity to voice their feelings on that matter. And then there's the People's Republic of China. Why didn't they participate? Well, the clue is in the way I said this country's name. I didn't just call it China. And the reason was to differentiate between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, otherwise known as Taiwan. The People's Republic of China were pissed that the Republic of China was going to be there, and just them being allowed to compete in the Olympics kind of validated their existence as a country, which the People's Republic of China was not in the mood to do. Incidentally, nor are they willing to do that today, but that's way beyond the scope of this video. So all in all, we had quite a few countries boycotting these games for a variety of reasons, none of which had anything to do with Australia or the good people of Melbourne. Too bad. The 1964 Tokyo Olympics. After those 1956 boycotts, folks seemed to have calmed down a touch, and we had a little window without a lot of drama. But that all flared up again in 1964 with the Tokyo Olympics, though fortunately it wasn't quite as bad this time. This time around, just 3 countries boycotted these Olympics: Indonesia, North Korea, and again, the People's Republic of China. But to explain why they weren't there, I have to give you a bit of a backstory. The year before, in 1963, something called the Games of the New Emerging Forces, or GANEFO for short, were hosted by Indonesia in Jakarta. Indonesia basically set up these games as a direct competitor to the Olympic Games themselves, and it was established specifically for the athletes of the so-called emerging nations. Indonesia set this up after the 1962 Asian Games, which were also held in Jakarta. Both the Republic of China, that's Taiwan, remember, as well as Israel, were refused entry cards into these games, which went right against the IOC's policies around inclusion. This pissed off the IOC so much that Indonesia was suspended by the IOC, marking the first time the IOC had ever done this. This ban was eventually reversed in time for the 1964 Olympics, but despite being eligible, tensions were still very high, and Indonesia chose to boycott these Olympics instead. This was primarily because the IOC was refusing to accept any athletes who had participated in that GANEFO event. And related to the same GANEFO issues, North Korea and the People's Republic of China also chose to boycott alongside Indonesia. Such a wild story. The 1976 Montreal Olympics. If you thought those first few boycotts were something, we are now getting into the elite boycotts, if there could be such a thing as an elite boycott. Nearly 36 countries, mainly from Africa, boycotted the 1976 Olympic Games in Montreal, making it the biggest boycott up until that point. And I stress up until that point, more to come. Anyways, this boycott of course came down to politics, and specifically politics that uniquely impacted Africa. But interestingly and unexpectedly for today, Africans were pissed at New Zealand. Earlier in 1976, the New Zealand rugby team did a tour of South Africa. This tour was in direct and overt defiance of the United Nations calls for an embargo on sporting events in South Africa, which at the time was neck deep in their notoriously brutal and racist apartheid policies. New Zealand went ahead with their trip, and this ticked off the rest of Africa in a huge way, and yeah, you can understand where that came from. The nations of Africa called on the International Olympic Committee to ban New Zealand from the 1976 Olympics because of this, and when the IOC refused, basically all of Africa and some additional sympathetic nations said, "Nuts to you, we're not going to Montreal," and they didn't. This boycott, for some reason, gets quite overlooked in the history of the Olympics, mainly because of the other boycotts that followed it, but it's worth remembering because it was huge. The 1980 Moscow Olympics. Okay, this is the big one, the boycott we all think of when we think of Olympic boycotts. The 1980 Moscow Olympics are forever remembered, not for the sporting events themselves, but the politics that surrounded them. On paper, this should have been a pretty important Olympic Games for non-political reasons. It was the first Olympics to be held in the Eastern Bloc, it was the first one to be held in a Slavic language-speaking country, and it was the final Olympic Games for the outgoing IOC president, Michael Morris. It would also have been nice to bounce back after the hardcore boycotts of the previous Summer Olympics in Montreal, but yeah, that didn't happen. Around 66 countries, mainly led by the United States and its allies, boycotted these Olympics because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan right around that time. The Soviet invasion prompted US President Jimmy Carter to issue an ultimatum on January 20th, 1980, which stated that the US would boycott the Moscow Olympics if Soviet troops did not withdraw from Afghanistan within 1 month. And obviously, they didn't withdraw, and old Jimmy Carter don't bluff, so the boycott was on. Clearly, this led to a serious lack of competitiveness at the Olympics, given how many athletes were simply not there to compete. In turn, this led to the Soviet Union and East Germany absolutely dominating, culminating in the most skewed medal tally since the notorious 1904 St. Louis Olympics. It's also worth noting that a few countries boycotted these games for different reasons that are often forgotten. Iran, for example, under Ayatollah Khomeini, was hostile to both the US and the Soviet Union, so they decided to boycott the event when the Islamic Conference condemned the invasion. Multiple countries also cited economic challenges in not attending, so there was that. And then there was Taiwan, or Chinese Taipei as they were being called at the time. They boycotted the games in protest of signing of the Nagoya Declaration the previous year, in which the island was banned from calling itself the Republic of China during the Olympic Games. So given all of this, plus a lot more, it's fair to say that these games were all about that boycott. But unfortunately, we are nowhere near done. The 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. Now, one thing we didn't talk about in the previous section was how the Soviet Union and its allies felt about the 1980 boycott. It's worth remembering that even though it meant they won a ton of extra medals, it was also kind of embarrassing from a diplomatic perspective. And there's nothing like a little retaliation to settle the score, especially when the Olympics are being held in the belly of the American beast. The Los Angeles Olympics of 1984 saw more than a dozen Eastern Bloc countries boycott as payback for the 1980 boycott, led of course by the Soviet Union. Curiously, Romania still chose to participate in these Olympics despite being an Eastern Bloc country, so I wonder how that went down in the Kremlin. In addition to this Soviet-led political boycott, we had other political boycotts as well from Albania, Iran, Libya, and Upper Volta, which we now know as Burkina Faso. So from 1976 to 1984, we had back-to-back boycotts of the Summer Olympics. What a wild ride. And it couldn't possibly happen again, could it? The 1988 Seoul Olympics. Come on, again? For real? Yeah, totally true. Let's discuss. So the IOC at this point was totally done with the boycott, so they worked hard leading up to the 1988 Olympics in Seoul to avoid the Eastern Bloc countries bailing again. And in a way, they succeeded. But what they couldn't control was Seoul's neighbor, North Korea. Believe it or not, there were actually negotiations for portions of the 1988 Olympics, namely specific events, to actually happen inside North Korea, which seems wild today, but it was indeed the goal at the time. That said, North Korea wanted 11 of 23 events to happen in North Korea, as well as to have special opening and closing ceremonies, which are some pretty big demands. The negotiations did not work out, shocker alert, so North Korea decided to just take their ball and go home, instead opting to boycott the Olympics altogether. Along with North Korea, its ally Cuba chose to boycott as well in solidarity. Nicaragua and Madagascar ended up boycotting due to financial reasons, and hilariously, Ethiopia, the Seychelles, and Albania just didn't respond to the invitation from the IOC and never showed up, which is a huge move, I gotta admit. Nice. Well, fortunately, that's the end of the list today. For those that are interested in a fun little drinking game, go back and watch the video again, and every time I say boycott, take a sip. And after that, leave your thoughts on the video in the comments below, unless you're gonna boycott the comments too. Oh, I said boycott, drink up.